Now it's Washington's turn to bid a final farewell to the late Senator John McCain. His body is lying in state under the US Capitol Rotunda for a public visitation and ceremony where Vice President Mike Pence is set to speak. On Saturday, a formal funeral service will be held at the Washington National Cathedral. Now, while former Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush are expected to deliver eulogies, the country's current leader, Donald Trump, has unofficially been asked to stay away. Well, for more on this, I'm joined on set by Douglas Herbert, France 24's international affairs commentator. Doug, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's talk about the legacy of John McCain, first of all. He really reached across the aisle and commanded respect in the Senate, even among those who were critical of him. What is it about McCain that's gripped the nation and stirred such tributes?
Exactly that. The fact that he is now seen, his death is seen almost as a passing of an era in the U.S. The political landscape has become so starkly partisan that the very word bipartisan, that is working together across the political divide, across the aisle, it's really not happening anymore in Washington. John McCain was famous for being able to go across that aisle literally on legislative efforts, on bills. He worked on campaign finance reform bills with famous Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, gave their name to that bill. He worked on immigration reform. He very famously bucked his party's leadership when he gave that thumbs down, casting the decisive vote against a Republican proposal to repeal Obama's signature health care policy. He was a maverick, but someone who was able to sort of take the politics out of things. Even though he was a staunch Republican, he was a conservative Republican, he was able to work with other people, and both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm talking about even people who really viscerally often disagreed with his politics, saw him as a conservative politician that they would never see eye to eye on the political issues. They knew he was someone they could work with. They saw him as a guy that they loved to travel with on his many missions abroad. They saw him as a guy with a sense of humor. And above all, I think there was an admiration and a respect, a bipartisan admiration and respect for this man. Yes, a man with a complex legacy, a flawed politician, but someone that they knew at the end of the day they could work with and trust. Someone, the words you hear are truth and principle and putting duty above politics.
Now, in his later years, it was his personal showdown with President Trump that made quite a few headlines. He was one of the rare Republicans to take him on.
Absolutely rare, maybe the only one actually right now. Now you could say that, look, once he was diagnosed with brain cancer, you could argue that, okay, he was then emboldened by that. He knew that his days were numbered. He said, now or never if I'm going to see down this president. They had, they'd always had a contentious relationship. The thing with John McCain, though, is that, he was a staunch Republican, but he actually saw Donald Trump as someone who had hijacked the Republican Party and, in a sense, deformed it. He turned it into a perverted version of itself. And whereas John McCain sort of represented perhaps the old spirit of the Republican Party, type of Republican Party I was talking about before, he really had very little patience for a Donald Trump, who he saw as a man who was wedded to narcissism, to demagoguery, whereas people saw McCain as being a true patriot, someone who put their country first, someone who at the end of the day made lots of mistakes but was able to admit they made mistakes. John McCain, unlike Trump, was able to acknowledge things. One thing he was able to acknowledge he got wrong, his support for the Iraq War in later years. He wasn't as staunchly in support of that. He urged America to fight a lot of wars abroad. He was not so much a warmonger, but he believed that these wars were actually winnable, including the Vietnam War at a certain point in which he was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. And yet, he still thought through that it was winnable if only the commanders had perhaps bombed a little bit more. His views were very controversial, but when he made mistakes, he was able to say he had. And most notably, when he picked Sarah Palin, the Alaska governor, to be his running mate, that famous, notorious pick in the 2000 race against Barack Obama, he later acknowledged relatively quickly that he had made a mistake. I think John McCain saw before him that some of those crowds, echoes of the types of very far-right, nationalistic type tone in the crowds in his rallies, and I think there was a certain part of John McCain that was a little bit horrified by what he had stirred up. And he had that famous thing where he talked back to a woman at a rally who said, I don't like Obama, he's an Arab. John McCain said, no, he's a decent, upstanding American citizen. I just happen to have some political disagreements with him.
That's right. I do happen to remember that episode. Douglas Herbert, France 24's international affairs commentator, thank you very much for your insight.